Brothers, it's time to watch another horror movie. Today, we continue with the American horror series, Daybreakers. In the distant year of 2027, a devastating plague sweeps across the globe. Humanity has transformed into bloodthirsty vampires. In this new era, power, transportation, and authority are all controlled by vampires. Only when night falls does the city show signs of life. The few remaining humans have been imprisoned in specialized blood-harvesting facilities. Iron restraints bind their bodies, numbing their nerves so they can be drained more efficiently. For humans, now breathing has only one purpose: to produce blood. Watching all this is a vampire scientist whose heart aches with guilt. He is an expert researching a substitute for human blood, and one of the very few vampires who still feels compassion for humanity. But even as a brilliant doctor, Edward feels powerless. After all, the world belongs to the majority, and now that majority is vampires. As the prized asset of a massive blood corporation, Edward is under immense pressure to quickly develop a blood substitute. The crisis is worsening. With supplies running dangerously low, lower-class vampires have begun feeding on each other. However, due to their genetic makeup, if vampires consume non-human blood, their bodies mutate, their brains deteriorate, their limbs deform, and they lose all rationality, becoming feral bat-like creatures driven by pure instinct, attacking anything in sight. Under pressure from the elite ruling class, Edward begins another experiment. The process seems simple. Inject a volunteer soldier with the synthetic blood prototype known as T3. Side effects may include a slight rise in body temperature. Edward calmly reminds the soldier not to panic. But almost instantly, the temperature skyrockets far beyond expectations. Faced with the silent, judging stares of powerful executives, Edward pushes forward and injects the remaining serum. "I feel fine." Moments later, despite emergency intervention, the test subject's body violently ruptures. He dies. Edward stands frozen. It's not merely grief, it's despair. He knows that below the city, countless humans in blood banks continue to die daily. If he cannot succeed, more vampires will devolve into monsters. On his way home, Edward narrowly avoids a car accident. He skillfully steadies his vehicle, but the other car stalls completely. To his shock, several humans step out. Without hesitation, the woman fires a wooden crossbow bolt straight into Edward's arm. Wood is lethal to vampires. If it pierces the heart, they die instantly. She prepares to fire again, but distant police sirens approach. The crash has drawn attention. The humans panic, but Edward unexpectedly tells them to get into his car. Again and again, he insists he means no harm. Reluctantly, they trust him. Since vampires must avoid sunlight, Edward's car windows are equipped with protective shielding. When the police arrive, they see only a darkened vehicle. Edward lies smoothly, claiming he saw humans run southeast. Humans are extremely rare now. Capturing a few would mean great merit. The officers speed away. Inside the car, tension finally eases. Before parting, the woman meaningfully says, "See you again," and she also wishes him a happy birthday. Earlier, she had noticed his work badge, a blood researcher, but birthdays mean little to Edward now. This is his 10th, 35th birthday. Vampires do not age normally. That night, Edward's younger brother, Eric, a military officer responsible for hunting down escaped humans, brings him a rare gift: a bottle of 100% pure human blood. Even elite white-collar vampires can now only afford 20% purity, but Edward refuses to drink it. In a heated argument, he pours the entire bottle down the drain. Eric is furious. To him, this is betrayal. Edward's true goal in developing synthetic blood is to end the hunting of humans altogether. Suddenly, a mutated vampire tracks the scent of blood into Edward's home. It sees writing in blood on the wall and begins to lick it wildly. The brothers freeze. Eric draws his blade and attacks. The creature moves like a missile, slamming Eric aside. It leaps onto the ceiling, fully transformed into a monstrous bat-like predator. With military precision, Eric slashes open its abdomen and, seizing the moment, decapitates it. The threat ends. For now, Edward knows the truth. If synthetic blood isn't perfected soon, more citizens will become these terrifying creatures. The next night, Edward unexpectedly reunites with Jesse, one of the humans he met before. Jesse gives him an address and claims synthetic blood is not the cure. There is a better solution, a way to turn vampires back into humans. The following day, Edward cautiously goes to the meeting place. They gather beneath a large tree, carefully avoiding sunlight. An older man reveals bite marks on his neck and declares that he, too, was once a vampire, but has undergone a transformation and is now fully human again. Edward refuses to believe it until he sees the man standing freely in sunlight, his body temperature warm, unmistakably human. Before they can talk further, Jesse is ambushed. The attacker is Eric, Edward's own brother, who followed him. Tension erupts. Reinforcements arrive. Jesse shoves Eric into direct sunlight. One pursuer falls, but another advances. Edward rushes everyone into the car. They speed away as bullets shatter the rear window. Blinding sunlight beams through the holes, making it almost impossible for Edward to drive. Ahead lies a narrow wooden bridge. Veteran driver Audrey grabs the wheel and floors it. The first pursuing armored vehicle plunges into the ravine below. The others halt, unable to follow. Escaping the chase, the trio races against time. Before nightfall, they reach an abandoned distillery. Along the way, Audrey explains how he transformed from vampire back into human. He had become a normal human again. Before the pandemic, he had simply been a car mechanic who loved working on engines. After turning into a vampire, he made a living installing sunshield systems in vehicles so vampires could drive during the day. That very morning, he had rushed to a client's house for a job. Since daytime roads were completely clear, he sped up to 140 miles per hour. While enjoying the weakened sunlight filtering through the protective film, he lost focus for just a moment, and the car slammed into a guardrail. He screamed in agony as flames erupted across his body. Later, he recalled that the sensation was like being thrown into a boiling vat of oil. Fortunately, beneath the crash site was a river. The water extinguished the flames. Semi-conscious, he rose from the water, gasping for air. Instinctively, he took a deep breath. Even though his body was exposed to direct sunlight, nothing happened. That was when he realized he might have discovered salvation. Now they needed to safely recreate that transformation process. That's why they sought out the experienced Dr. Edward. But as Edward's ears slowly began to sharpen, a sign of instability, Jesse quickly cut his own palm and forced Edward to drink some blood. Edward had to remain mentally stable. They were still hiding many humans, and they couldn't risk him losing control and attracting unnecessary trouble. Meanwhile, the vampire world was spiraling into chaos. Beggar-like vampires attacked civilians in the streets. The number of feral mutants kept rising. All of this stemmed from one cause: a blood shortage. Lower-class vampires were now receiving blood with only 5% purity. At a cafe, an enraged white-collar vampire slammed his cup down and shouted, "Put more damn blood in my coffee! I can't take this anymore!" Starving and desperate, he reached out to grab more. At first, the crowd behind him remained indifferent, but when bags of fresh blood burst open and splattered everywhere, the fragile restraint of society collapsed. The primal frenzy encoded in their genes could no longer be suppressed. Fortunately, the government had already deployed large numbers of troops to maintain order, and the riot was eventually subdued. On the other side, Edward began testing. He exposed the mechanic's blood to ultraviolet light, but the reaction appeared no different from a vampire's. So how had he turned human? Confused, he asked him to carefully recall every detail of that day. Finally, the mechanic said the key words: lightning It kick-started my heart. That sentence changed everything. Edward theorized that the transformation was triggered by a specific bodily reaction. If they could precisely control the amount of sunlight exposure, perhaps they could replicate the process. Conveniently, Jesse's family-owned distillery had suitable equipment. The fermentation furnace had a powerful ventilation fan that could quickly remove air and extinguish flames. During the experiment, they could use this system to prevent fatal combustion. Meanwhile, within the human resistance camp, their leader, nicknamed Old Black, continued his mission of rescuing survivors and bringing them to headquarters. This time, he found more than a dozen people. However, the journey was long, and night had already fallen. Though the night was quiet, except for insects chirping, he couldn't shake the feeling of danger. Suddenly, sparks flashed. His tire had blown out. A tranquilizer dart had pierced it. Instantly, he knew the situation was dire. The military had stopped using lethal ammunition. Now they preferred capturing humans alive. The resistance members grabbed their weapons and took defensive positions. But before they could react, waves of vampire soldiers emerged from the darkness. They were vastly outnumbered. Within minutes, the human group was overwhelmed. Only one girl managed to grab a radio and call for help. The mechanic responded, but the signal cut off abruptly. Leading the assault was Eric. Using the intercepted transmission, he located the resistance headquarters. For the vampire forces, it was a complete victory. Back at the distillery, sensing something was wrong, the mechanic urged everyone to retreat. But Edward refused. The sun was about to rise. He had to complete the experiment. This was humanity's last hope. Jesse and the mechanic stayed behind with him, fully prepared to die if necessary. Elsewhere, the captured girl awoke in a familiar office. It turned out she was the daughter of Edward's boss, the chairman of the massive blood corporation. Before the outbreak, she had terminal cancer with no hope of survival. The pandemic had cured her, wiping out her cancer and granting her immortality. In the chairman's eyes, this was humanity's perfect evolution. But her daughter rejected the vampire world. She had been fleeing for years. Now, captured again, she defiantly stabbed her father. The once gentle chairman erupted in fury. He locked her in a cell and ordered Eric to forcefully turn her into a vampire. He believed once transformed, she would submit, enjoying endless blood and eternal life under his control. But the girl's will was unbreakable. She refused to drink any blood. Instead, she began starving herself, accelerating the mutation process, willing to destroy her own body rather than surrender. Faced with such a stubborn, defiant daughter, the old father finally made a ruthless decision. He tied his daughter, together with the mutated subsiders, onto a military tank. It was noon. The sun burned mercilessly overhead. Amid screams filled with resentment and despair, the degraded vampires were dragged into open sunlight, condemned to be burned alive like disposable creatures. Last in line was the chairman's daughter. In just 2 days, she had transformed from a human into a grotesque monster. Though her appearance was horrifying, her spirit stood far above the onlookers around her. Suddenly, she grabbed Eric, the one who had turned her. A powerful wave of guilt struck him. In that moment, he remembered something he had long buried. He, too, had once been human. Meanwhile, under the tightening siege of the military, Edward and the others began their experiment under immense pressure. The procedure was simple. Open the furnace vents and carefully control the intensity of sunlight hitting Edward's body. Jesse monitored the heart rate machine, watching for any sign of a restored heartbeat. As the sun shield was lifted, sunlight poured in. Instantly, Edward's body burst into flames. Jesse quickly activated the exhaust system, removing oxygen and extinguishing the fire. But the monitor showed no change. They had to try again. One more time. This time, Edward's heart showed the faintest reaction, 2 weak beats, and then silence. Gritting his teeth through unbearable pain, Edward demanded another attempt. Outside, soldiers were less than 100 meters away. Jesse stared at the monitor, barely daring to breathe. Then, Edward's heart began beating again, rhythmic, Steady, they had done it. Overwhelmed and exhausted, Edward collapsed. The golden glow in his vampire eyes slowly faded under the sunlight. They hid inside a liquid-filled fermentation tank, narrowly escaping the soldiers' search. Believing the humans had fled, the troops eventually withdrew. Now they had a cure. But a new problem emerged. How could they convince vampires to undergo such a painful transformation? Edward immediately thought of Nolan, his assistant of 6 years at the corporation. But during Edward's absence, Nolan had achieved an astonishing thing. He had developed the long-awaited blood substitute. That evening, as Nolan returned home, Edward and the others confronted him at his doorstep. Seeing Edward's changed appearance, Nolan was stunned. Edward reassured him and explained the sunlight experiment, hoping to gain Nolan's secret support. But would Nolan truly abandon his life's work? The synthetic blood he had poured everything into? At that moment, Nolan received a phone call. He casually said it was his ex-wife and stepped into his study next door. Minutes passed. Something felt wrong. When Jesse went to check, Edward realized the truth. The call had never disconnected. The landline Nolan dialed wasn't to his ex-wife. It was to the military. Before they could react, soldiers stormed in. Jesse was knocked unconscious and dragged away. Only then did they realize they had walked straight into Nolan's trap. Audrey struck a soldier square in the chest. Taking advantage of the explosion, the two of them bolted out through the back door. They rushed down the stairs, cut through an underground tunnel, and burst into an abandoned factory. But the moment the lights flicked on, a feral subsider stood directly in front of Edward. At the critical moment, it was his younger brother, Eric, who saved him. Even though Edward desperately promised he could turn him back into a human, Eric refused to give up his stance. He even brought up Edward's past. Back when Edward had first been turned, he had been just like the chairman's daughter, unwilling to accept becoming a vampire, even if it meant death. Now, Eric felt the same. If he turned back into a human, he would lose his high-ranking military position, and with it, the power to protect his brother. He promised to help Edward escape, and even handed over his crossbow as a sign of trust. But just as Audrey reached for it, Eric's eyes suddenly flared with madness. He lunged forward and bit into Audrey's neck. To Edward, this seemed utterly hopeless. He raised the crossbow, ready to execute his own brother. But then, Eric's body began convulsing violently. He gasped. He started breathing. The change had begun. Seeing this, Edward immediately formed a new plan. Without hesitation, he headed straight back to the corporate headquarters where he once worked. Inside the office, Jesse was already captured, his vampire superior savoring her blood. The executive proudly revealed that his team had perfected the blood substitute. Once mass-produced, it would generate limitless wealth and cement their control over the world. He rejected the cure outright, even mocked Edward. "You're no longer useful," he sneered, clearly intending to have him executed. Despite the humiliation, Edward remained calm. He mentioned the chairman's daughter. He delivered a devastating blow with one line: "If you couldn't even do it for your own daughter, then who's the coward?" The words struck deep. Enraged, the executive bit into Edward. But within moments, just like Eric before him, his body reacted violently. He collapsed. His golden vampire eyes faded. He transformed back into a human. Edward had no intention of sparing him. Before reinforcements arrived, he had the former executive tied up and dragged before a group of starving vampires. In that moment, no one cared about rank or status. Hunger erased hierarchy. They swarmed him. Inside the elevator, they tore him apart. Ironically, even in death, the executive helped spread the cure. Edward and Jesse hurried toward the lobby, but soldiers blocked their path. They were trapped. At the most critical moment, a black car smashed through the lobby's glass entrance. It was Eric. He had come back to save them. With swift, lethal precision, he eliminated the soldiers. But reinforcements quickly flooded the building. surrounding the lobby completely. Eric, who had just transformed back into a human, began to panic. "There's a cure!" he shouted to his former comrades. But the starving vampires had already lost all reason. They lunged at him. Eric met the same fate as the executive, devoured piece by piece. There was no escape in that direction. Edward dragged Jesse into the security room. Through the surveillance cameras, they watched a horrifying chain reaction unfold. The first vampire who fed on Eric turned back into a human. Then other starving vampires attacked that newly turned human. They transformed. Then they were attacked in turn. The cycle repeated again and again, a gruesome domino effect. When Edward and Jesse finally stepped back into the lobby, it was nearly empty. Moments earlier, it had been packed. Now, silence. As Edward knelt beside his brother's body, grief washing over him, Nolan suddenly appeared with a gun. He shot the remaining soldiers and pointed the weapon at Edward. Nolan didn't want his life's work destroyed. He wanted to defeat Edward fairly, once and for all. Just as he was about to pull the trigger, an arrow pierced straight through Nolan's heart. Audrey had arrived in time. As Edward stood over his brother's still warm body, the sun rose once more. They held hope in their hands. But in a world of scarcity and mutation, absolute justice struggles to overcome absolute hunger. "We're here. We can change you back. It's not too late."